welcome everybody to the Youth Vaping webinar. I'm sorry, we're starting straight away because we've got a wide variety of speakers and we're going to have to run a really tight ship this lunchtime to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak and also that we get to ask some questions and have a really interesting panel discussion at the end. I'm Kirsten Waters. I'm Director of Public Health and Wellbeing, including Public Health and Children's Health Services at Camden. And I'm also the Children and Young People's Lead for the Association of Directors of Public Health for London. Just some housekeeping. Please make sure if you're not speaking that you have your microphones off. Otherwise, we do get some feedback. And also to let you know that this will be recorded, I think. Yes, it will be. And we're going to have to be really strict on time. Next slide, please. Thanks. Just so we're all aware of the aims, we've got an hour and a half, so we're finishing at 1:30. And we want to present the latest evidence and best practice following the government's announcements on young people and vaping. And we want to facilitate the development of evidence-based proportionate responses for young people and vaping and across the system. And I think it's really great that we've got such a wide variety of speakers here this afternoon from different organisations. And to respond and answer questions and concerns about young people and vaping that you may have. We may not get through all questions, but we will collate them and we will send round answers or signpost people to the appropriate resources if we're not able to do that this afternoon. So just to remind people on the recent announcements before we get started. Next slide, please. Oh, next order, we've gone back one. Okay, fantastic. Okay, just so we can start. So there was a new policy initiative, so it was announced at the Conservative Party conference, and following that, we've had a publication of Stopping the Start, our plan to create a smoke-free generation. And there are four main strands for that. Prevent smoking before it starts, and that's raising access, the age limit for buy tobacco to mirror the New Zealand model. Supporting current smokers to quit, and there's an additional new money of 70 million to support stop smoking services across England, and additional financing to raise for awareness raising campaigns and to fund national campaigns to highlight the harms of smoking. A national expansion of the Swap to Stop scheme, recognising that there's been patchy provision across England, and financial incentives for pregnant smokers to quit. There's a consultation out on the measures that we can do to reduce the marketing of vaping and stopping vaping in young people. And that's creating a smoke-free generation, tackling youth vaping, your views, and that's out for consultation currently. We're encouraging everybody to be able to respond to that consultation. And enforcement, an additional 30 million for trading standards, border force and HMRC. Illicit tobacco strategy to be produced, on-the-spot fines and online age verification. There's the links put into these slides so you can have a look in those in more detail. Just the next slide, please. And I just wanted to start by framing this. So I'm Director of Public Health in Camden. This picture was taken last week that was put up overnight, which is about a 6 foot by 4 foot illegal ad for vaping in Camden Town. That was not only illegal, but it's actually criminal damage because that is a pub, that's a privately owned residential building, advertising quality touch, quality vapes. There's an awful lot of young people. It's near a school. So I think this highlights some of the action that is needed to tackle the rise in youth vaping. We use this to garner cross-party support for the government announcements. And I think it's really important that we're able locally to get local councillors to be vocal in their support for the measures that are being introduced. And our lead cabinet member, Councillor Anna Wright from Labour, was then, when we were contacted by Camden New Journal and various other press outlets, was able to use this as an opportunity to highlight why tighter regulation is needed, why and how that marketing of vaping is so effective amongst young children when we have tactics like this, but also to highlight her cross-party support and to have a Labour Party local motion for support for the announcements that were at the Conservative Party conference and for the current government. So I think there's opportunities that we can all use across the system, enable to make sure that there is really strong support. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on to our first speaker now. It's Professor Ann McNeill. She's Professor of Tobacco Addiction at King's College London, and she's going to set the scene talking about the pattern, prevalence and harms of young people vaping. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. So yes, there'll be two halves to my talk, one looking at prevalence and patterns and the other looking at the health harms. And I'll be drawing on this series of evidence reviews that we've written, commissioned by the government over the last 7 or 8 years. We've been tracking youth vaping and smoking and also adult behaviours. And our last report focused particularly on health risks. Next, please. So next slide, please. So we've drawn on a number of different surveys. This is the survey used by government to track their tobacco control impact. So it's of 11 to 15-year-old school children in England. And as you can see from the blue line, current smoking has been declining steadily, particularly since the turn of the century when the comprehensive tobacco control strategy was introduced. And vaping, the red line, has been going up since it was monitored first in 2014, but you can see that series ends in 2021. So we also draw on more recent data. Next slide, please, which is from the ASH surveys. These are great surveys done every year by ASH, Action on Smoking and Health. And again here, the black line is current smoking and the orange line is current vaping. And you can see there's a bit of a blip in 2021, which was the first time the surveys captured the impact of COVID, because these surveys are run early in the year. So if you ignore that little blip, you can see that vaping in the orange line has been going steadily up, whereas smoking has been sort of steadily declining with a little bit of movement around. Next slide, please. What we're also seeing, however, is that vaping experimentation has increased, and these are among 11 to 17-year-old, these slides, so people for whom it is illegal to be sold vapes. And you can see there was a 50% increase in experimentation over the last year. Next slide, please. And what we're also seeing is an increase in the use of vaping by never smokers. So you can see that increase over the last couple of years in this graph. But look at the scale. It is still rare, only 2.3% of never smokers, but nevertheless, it is an increase. Next slide, please. And when asked why they've tried vaping, so the orange bars here are never smokers, you can see the most popular reason is just to give it a try. So a lot of it is experimentation. The black bars are for people who have smoked, and you can see here there's a greater range of reasons with using them instead of smoking, which obviously is beneficial to their health. Next slide, please. And what we are seeing here in this graph, again from the ASH surveys, is the blue line, the blue bars going up. So they're disposable electronic cigarettes. And there used to be cigalikes, which look very much like cigarettes, but as you're all aware, these new puff bars have come on the market, brightly coloured, accessible, cheap products with very popular and friendly names, as you can see in the picture here. And you can see that rapid rise in the use of disposables with the use of other types of e-cigarettes gone down. And then finally in this section, next slide, please, we've also drawn on data from 16 to 19-year-olds from an international survey. And this is also showing increases in vaping, but it has also shown some recent increases in smoking in this older age group. So that's obviously something we want to watch. And there's been some divergence from patterns in the US and Canada. That's in press, but will be coming out soon. So next slide, please. I'm going to move now on to the health harms of young people vaping. Next, please. And here drawing on this last report. Now, in this report, we looked at objective measures of health impacts, but there are some studies which have looked at self-reported symptoms, and they do show that vaping is associated with respiratory symptoms such as cough, in a similar way to smoking is, but it may therefore exacerbate asthma. And indeed, we've got a similar study coming out next year on this. So what we looked at were these objective biomarkers, so looking at the body and seeing what's in the body of people who vape. And there was only a few of these. So what I'm going to draw on here are the data from adults, because it's unlikely that it's going to be different for youth. And many studies had methodological issues. So I'm focusing on one type of biomarker, next slide please, which is biomarkers of exposure. So these are sort of chemicals that move around the body, and some of them are toxic. And we've drawn on the WHO list of priority toxicants, as you can see from these compounds at the bottom. So I'm going to start with nicotine, because there's a lot of talk about nicotine. Next slide please. And what we're seeing, what we know, is nicotine is the reason why people smoke tobacco cigarettes, but it's not what kills them. It's a relatively benign substance. Not all vapes contain nicotine, but they're common, they typically do, and the ones that people use contain nicotines, indicating that nicotine is the reason why people continue to use them. What we found is that nicotine exposure over time is similar for vapers versus smokers, but the dependence on vaping tends to be lower than dependence on smoking. But most of those studies were done before these newer vaping products came on the market, and we are seeing and hearing, as you will be, reports of young people being dependent on their vapes. Next slide, please. But if we look across other biomarkers of exposure, so these are biomarkers which are toxicants and contribute to the 3 big diseases caused by cigarette smoking, which are cancer, lung and heart disease. When you look at vapers versus smokers, what we see is the toxicant levels found in people who vape are significantly lower compared with people who smoke. So that's a good thing, they're less harmful. However, when you compare vapers versus non-users, sometimes you get the same levels, which is good, but sometimes they're higher compared with people who don't use either product, suggesting that there are some effects of vaping. So our conclusions from our report, next slide please, were that vaping poses only a small fraction of the risks of smoking in the short to medium term, and can therefore be used as an alternative to smoking to reduce the harmfulness of smoking. But they shouldn't be looked at as risk-free, particularly for people who've never smoked, and they should be discouraged from taking up vaping, unless of course they would smoke instead. But what we do know is that, unfortunately, there are growing misperceptions of the relative risks of vaping versus smokers in both youth and adults. So in the next slide, this is just again of young people. Next slide, please. The orange line shows the correct answer, which is that vaping is less harmful than smoking, and young people's perceptions that they're less harmful has been going down. So the message here is that young people are vaping not because they assume that vapes are risk-free. So I think that's an important message to go out. There are these other factors which are playing a role. And then just a couple of final slides on health harms. One, next slide please, is around hospitalizations, which you might have picked up in the media. So what we are seeing are some admissions for under 20-year-olds for vaping-related disorder in 2022. This doesn't mean that it's causal, it's just that this is what's been put down on the form. But we do need to put this in the perspective of around 5,000 child admissions every year because of passive smoke exposure. So it's really important to get our communications right here. And then the next slide is just of 11 to 15-year-olds. And the top set of bars are those young people for whom it's okay to see what it's like to try something. And then the bottom set are those for which it's okay to use weekly. So yes, it's important that we reduce the proportion that think it is okay to vape weekly, but we need to be careful we don't push people to some of these other potentially more harmful, well, definitely more harmful in some cases, behaviours. So to summarise, next slide, this is my final slide. Vaping has increased in young people over recent years, increase in experimentation and uptake by never smokers, and it's associated with these really attractive and accessible puff bars. We are seeing reports of young people dependent on vaping, likely due to nicotine, and it's important to say that inhaling vapes on a regular and sustained basis over time, particularly if starting from a young age, is likely to have harmful effects. References on the next slide, which you can skip over, and just to say thank you very much to colleagues for sharing slides and also to you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's a fantastic scene setting for the next speakers, who are from the Royal Borough of Greenwich. That's a local authority perspective. It's Wendy, Elcombe and Jennifer Banks-Smith. I'm handing over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here today and give us an opportunity to talk to you about vaping from a local authority perspective and what we've been doing in Greenwich. Next slide, please. Just to give a little bit of a background, we have a very long history of working with trading standards in partnership in Greenwich, and this has really been over about 15 to 20 years, in fact. A lot of you know me, and I've been around forever, so I've always worked really closely with trading standards. We've also had a very good relationship linking in London-wide around illegal tobacco. Many of you remember that, you know, the Stamp It Out campaigns that we toured and did enforcement work and sniffer dogs and a lot of comms. So we've got a long history in Greenwich of working with trading standards both within Greenwich and London-wide. And we've also had very excellent leadership support from our Director of Public Health, our members and our other leaders. And so it's always been something we've championed, that we know that it's really important to work with trading standards around enforcement around tobacco issues. We in Greenwich Public Health, we part fund a post within trading standards, and also recently we secured extra money to look around enforcement work around test purchasing, but in particular around our concern around vaping as well, and wanting to look at the illicit legal market around vaping in Greenwich. Trading standards support us with that, and have been doing work with schools, and my colleague Jennifer is going to talk a little bit more detail about what we've been doing with schools in Greenwich. And we've also been able to provide written statements for some of the criminal procedures that are going on around prosecutions that are selling illicit and tobacco and vapes, plus those that have been selling to those underage. So we've been able to support trading standards work, and they've been able to support us following a long history of working together. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we've been doing a lot of activity in partnership, and we've used some of the activity and insight and intel and evidence to look at licensing reviews. Last year, for example, we did a lot of inspections. We had 121 premises were visited, and within those 121, 47 premises were found to have non-compliant vapes, and those vapes were surrendered to traders. Interestingly, in other areas would have found this too, that some of the vapes that have been identified have had more than the maximum permitted amounts of puffs, which is obviously again a massive concern for young people, that they don't know what they're buying, they don't know what's in them, and they aren't realising how much they're exceeding their maximum level. We've also had 2 warrants issued on residential premises and 2 commercial premises. And within the courts, we've also been able to obtain a 3-month closure order against 1 premises and obtain fines of 12,000 costs and 15,000 plus 200 hours of unpaid work. There is a lot of other ongoing activity that we can update people on as we get it, but we just wanted to illustrate some of the work that we've been doing around the enforcement activity. I'm just going to pass on to Jennifer now, who will take the next slide, which is much more about the work that we've been doing in partnership in schools. So over to Jennifer. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Wendy, I've just had a message from Jennifer and her camera is frozen.
Oh, okay. Oh, she's stuck on mute.
She's stuck, yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, okay. So she's really got the detail of this, but just to say, we've listened to requests from schools, and via our lead within our public health team, undertaken delivering workshops with heads and deputy heads, and also with PSHE leads, safeguarding leads and school nurses, to make sure they're getting the information and support they need, because it is an ongoing issue and a problem. We've also done some work with school nursing with children and young people, and got a really excellent uptake of responses from that. Oh, is that Jennifer coming back in? Jennifer, yeah. Do you want to carry on?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, just to say, we had to work collectively together, but what was really encouraging, the schools were so keen to work with us on this, and just also identifying that there was different approaches from different schools. Some schools were excluding children for vaping, others weren't. So it's trying to get that practice across the board, saying this is not an exclusionary issue in isolation, it's only alongside with other disruptive behaviour. So getting that message across. Also hearing about really good practice in schools that was already going on. Some schools we are using like a speed awareness approach, whereby if they got caught vaping, they had to all come to a group and they were taught about the dangers of vaping and to write an assignment about the dangers of vaping, which has had a positive effect with that specific school. We've heard of other schools using metal detectors to try and deter children from bringing them into school. But obviously the good practice we're trying to share. Also, we undertook a survey with school nursing team, which managed to elicit over 1,945 responses from children and young people regarding vape. So really keen to speak up about this and to hear more and to be involved. We also worked with Trading Standards to produce maps for schools, so we could show where Trading Standards were aware that illegal and illicit tobacco and vapes were being sold, plus the underage sales too, so we could flag that to schools. We also were very much promoting Trading Standards contacts throughout the schools, because a lot of schools were just going directly to the police but weren't informing Trading Standards, so Trading Standards could follow up with that. We also produced letters to follow up to those shops that have been caught selling to underage vapes to underage children. So we also managed to include it in the shoe survey for this year coming up. So that's both primary and secondary school children will be asked questions on vape. So be very interested to see how that goes. Again, we've been briefing about the approach at schools, so that's really key. Next slide, please. This shows basically the things that we plan to do. Encourage with key stakeholders to respond to the government consultation. So we're really keen we get a really good and strong response from Greenwich. We're looking to try and get a task and finish group to across with the deputy heads across the borough, so we're working with them to get that going. Also to run focus groups so we can actually get a co-production model and to hear exactly what they're feeling about what's happening and how the media influences them. We continue to work with other boroughs. We've shared good practice with Newham, who are doing great work regarding their stuff in vapes, and also the same with Merton, but other boroughs across the sector we link in with, so we're not doing it alone and we're sharing good practice. As being flagged, the data, we know there's an issue, but we don't know the scale of it, so trying to understand what's happening in NHS trusts, in primary care, and we're also piloting with the community safety team so they can use questions about where are these young children getting their vapes from, and just to have conversations. We're giving them very brief advice training so they can have those conversations to say there is a way to stop vaping and to stop smoking. The next slide, please. This was just an illustration, be difficult to see on the scale, but it very much, we used Ash's survey questions in Greenwich, so just to reinforce that we were getting similar results, but at least we knew that for certain. And the last slide is just the illustration of how the Trading Standards and Public Health Intelligence mapped the shops that we knew were selling to underage children vapes and illicit tobacco and illicit vapes. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, both Wendy and Jennifer from Greenwich. There's lots of learning for other local authorities there. Moving on now to Shelby Davies, who is going to talk about young people's lived experience and in particular how we can encourage their views and engagement around the consultation on vaping. And she's from the Partnership for Young London. So welcome, Shelby.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So we recently held a focus group with a group of young people, and 3 main themes came out of this session, and they were education, peers, and accessibility and marketing. So I'm just going to talk you through some of the comments and themes that came out of the session. The first was education and the experience of schooling with vaping and how the curriculum deals with vaping. Some of the things that came out of this was the lack of content on vaping in schools. One of our young people said, I've had one assembly on vaping, but they only speak about the effects of nicotine addiction. And some of our other young people said that a lot of their PSHE lessons tell them not to vape, but not around the harms of why or anything like that. Something else that came up was that some of the young people felt that schools only care about it during school hours. One of the young people said that my school was saying don't vape at school, do it at the park. A lot of our young people said there was a lack of resources in schools to support young people. One of our young people said, I think it's a huge problem. I do not think there are enough resources to explain the harms it does to your body. From this, we asked young people to name us a service that they could go to. None of our young people could name a single service to support them with vaping. And the comments that came up on that were, I don't know of any places to help teenagers battling addiction, no matter what it is. I don't know where to go for support, and I don't know what support is out there. And the other side of the education was around how the effective schooling is affected by vaping. Some of the things that came up around this was the access to spaces for vapers and non-vapers. Some of our young people are talking about how if their whole friendship group are going to a vapers and they're using those vaping sections within their colleges, etc., they feel that they have to go there so that they're still with their friends. And something that came off the back of this as well was a lot of people felt they were breathing in the secondary air of these areas, and this has effects on things such as asthma. And a second point that came up was that toileting in schools is a big issue. We had lots of comments from the session around this, such as, I feel uncomfortable going into the toilets. I do not want to be associated with vaping through guilt. Bathrooms are a nightmare now. It's try this vape, try this new flavour, you can't get past it. It's a lucky draw if you can breathe in there. Toilets are hot boxes for vaping. Next slide, please. Something else that came up was peers. A big issue seems to be self-image and the popularity you have in school and how that links you to vaping. Somebody said, if you're not at the top of the hierarchy of schooling, you probably vape. And then someone else came back on top of this and said lots of people who are anti-vaping get mocked and laughed at school. Something else that came up amongst peers was the use of the sharing of vapes. Somebody said that lots of people share vapes, try new flavours, have a puff, which obviously links to the effects of bathrooms and outside spacing. And the final point on this was the selling of vapes during school hours. A lot of our young people explain that there's a hierarchy of youngers and older years selling to younger years, which also leads to peer pressure. We also asked the young people if they would talk to their peers about vaping or trying to stop to vape. This question got very negative responses that they did not feel that peer-to-peer conversations would help young people with educating of vaping or trying to stop. Some of the comments around this was, vaping is the new norm. I know a lot of people in secondary schools, if you aren't at the top, you don't have much to say in the decisions or opinions of your peers. And people are so set in their ways about vaping, they don't want to be conceived to change their ideas. Next slide, please. And the final theme I wanted to discuss with you was accessibility and marketing. Something that came out of our session was that a lot of young people explained that students are now using vaping as a business avenue around the fact that older years are. So someone said older year groups used to sell weed to year 9s and now it's turned to selling vapes. It's not just selling, but also people are sharing between friends. People are so addicted they're sharing flavours between each other. Another big issue is around corner shops. We had a lot of comments around corner shops. Some of these are about the fact that they're so accessible in corner shops. One comment we had was corner shops are a major challenge. They're mostly interested in money, not the health of young people. I went test purchasing with my council. None of the big shops sold to us, but all the small ones did. Mainly corner shops just don't seem to care. And the last point was around marketing and how a lot of our young people said they actually advertise like sweets. One of our young people said vapes are basically the new fruit pastels. Sweets have lots of colouring and it's replicated through vapes. Also, our young people mentioned the colouring around vape adverts, and our young people said vape adverts are not seen seriously. They're colourful and not seen as problems. Packaging on vapes do not prevent people from vaping. It actually attracts them through the bright colours. And vaping is seen as a joke. I'm addicted to flavoured air. And then the final thing was we asked our young people how what they want policymakers to do or hear or change. The three main things of this was changing the marketing and the advertising of vapes. Also resourcing, our young people said we just want information. And the third one was about safe spaces, which they said we need to prepare young people with a safe space to talk about their ideas and thoughts without feeling judgment. Yeah, it was a really good session, and hopefully we can continue our work with young people to get their voices heard within other organisations. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm on mute. Thanks so much, Shelby. That's really valuable insight and really useful to hear those views and feedbacks from young people. Moving on to Scott Butler, who is the Executive Director of Material Focus, who's going to talk about vaping and the environment.
Hi, I'm not sure if my camera will come on. I'm had technical issues before the start of this, so I'm a bit like Jean-Michel Jarre. I'm working off a laptop and a phone at the same time, but I will crack on. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the three sort of key takeaways. So we as Material Focus are interested in environmental issues, particularly recycling of electricals. And a vape is like any other electrical, anything with a plug, battery and cable. But the three sort of key takeaways from what I'm going to talk about here is that vape producers, importers have a legal responsibility to finance the take back of vapes for recycling, and they haven't been doing that. Vape retailers have a legal responsibility to take back customers' old vapes for recycling and to tell the customers that they do that. And they have barely done anything in regards to that. And consumers need to know a lot more that they should always recycle their vape rather than bin or litter them. And a key point here is that the Environment Agency has confirmed that vapes should never be incinerated, they must be recycled. So there's a lot of legal stuff around this, which clearly sets out the environmental challenges posed by vapes. Next slide, please. So who are we? As I said, we're an independent not-for-profit, and our focus is very much around reusing and recycling electricals. And we work in three areas. We do research, we invest in making it easier through new collection projects with local authorities and others. And we have a national consumer campaign called Recycle Your Electricals. And some of you may have had the pleasure of meeting our techno-loving psychedelic pink hypno cat across the last few months. And if you have, I'm sure you will never forget him. Next slide, please. But what is e-waste and why is it relevant to vapes? Next slide. So e-waste is basically old unwanted electrical equipment. It's one of the fastest growing waste streams in the world. Electricals are full of the most valuable materials on the planet, and we're losing them if it goes to bins. Also, if littered in the incorrect place, which many vapes are, there's a risk of toxicity to land and water. And basically, this is recognized about 15, 20 years ago, and there has been long established legislation in place to make the producers of electrical equipment responsible for dealing with them at the end of life. And that's the thing like fridge take back, washing machines, small electrical take back, and vapes are part of that system. They have and have always been an electrical item and an electrical waste when they reach end of life. Next slide, please. So why are vapes such an issue? So sales have rocketed, as we've seen earlier. This is a phenomenon. It's come out of nowhere and has grown like nothing else. Vapes themselves are made of the most valuable resources on the planet: steel, aluminium, copper and lithium. Copper and lithium are particularly important to the green technology future. So environmental damage is caused through widespread littering. Vapes themselves are toxic waste. The lithium batteries inside of them are also prone to causing fires if damaged. So when they're binned and they go on to waste trucks and are crushed, then fires can be caused. And we've had 700 waste fires over the last year in the UK, many of them significant, related to lithium-ion batteries in black bin bags. Single-use vapes are often marketed as disposable, not recyclable, which is very dangerous because that word already suggests to us that we should be able to throw them away. And there's very little communications on options for recycling. And that's still the case despite the fact that we've been talking about this for 18 months. And the latest stats that we found out is that on average now 7.7 million single-use vapes are being sold every week in the UK, and the vast majority of them are being binned. 5 million a week, which is around 8 per second. There has never been certainly any electrical product like this. And actually we're on record, or I'm on record as stating that this could be the most environmentally damaging, wasteful and dangerous consumer product ever sold. So it's a biggie. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we're throwing away millions of them. Up to 80% of the materials within the vapes can be recovered. There is a bit that can go to energy from waste, but we don't include that in our statistics. And as I said before, there's hidden treasure inside those vapes, and that's lithium and copper, but also the other materials too. The equivalent of 500 electric vehicle batteries worth of lithium are being thrown away every year at the moment. Next slide. Yeah, the lithium cells could be powering the green economy. The batteries are causing fires. And basically, vapes are the fastest growing waste stream of the fastest growing waste stream in the world. And we're throwing away over 100,000 tons of electrical waste. And vapes, the single-use vapes are a brand new waste that's being added to that problem and that challenge. Next slide. So this is a quick run through about what people need to be doing. Next slide, please. So as producers, they need to be joining compliance schemes. Those compliance schemes will then should be working to go and collect enough electricals, enough vapes to meet the targets set by DEFRA. But vapes have posed a real challenge in that they're a brand new category, and the regulations weren't geared for having hundreds of millions of small electrical products distributed everywhere, and therefore they're sort of falling through loopholes at the moment. So if vape initially research that we did, hardly anybody was registered. We shouted about that. They started to register, but they're registering in a category, a small electrical category called Category 7, Toys and Leisure, ironically. And therefore, their actual obligations and their actual costs are not being captured. DEFRA are consulting at the moment to create a special vape category. But even if a vape producer is registered at the moment, it's paying nowhere near the actual cost of collecting and recycling the vapes or what those costs would be. Next slide. Next slide. So retailers have different obligations. And basically, pretty much if you sell it, then you should be responsible for taking it back. So there are some sort of deviations, but the general rule is we're seeing how popular these vapes are. Pretty much every store that sells a vape should be a take-back point for the vapes. It's as easy to buy a vape as it is a Kit Kat. It's far less easy to recycle them. Next slide. Next slide. These are, I've put more detail in here just to make it so it's more useful when you see the slide deck. Yeah, next slide, please. So there are options here. The guidance that we provide free of charge. This is part of a bigger briefing paper where we've advised producers and retailers to all the options that they have to recycle. Next slide. And this is a list of vape recycling services that exist. These are private companies who set up these services. So these are paid for, but they are all approved and authorized waste management and recycling companies. And there are more, but this is a list of some of the key ones. Next slide. So on sort of messaging around this, the key message is that these should never be binned. They should be recycled. And it's very, very important that the message that all vapes can be recycled. So the rechargeable ones and the single-use ones can be recycled. The challenge that we have is, though, it does not matter how recyclable something is if it's not collected for recycling. And this is a real challenge at the moment, building a strong collection network, and not just through retailers, but through public spaces and through bars and nightclub areas and wherever and shopping centres where they're being used. And that's what we've been calling out for the industry to do. And the industry has made small gestures, but is still far from stepping up and meeting its obligations. And those, partly because of that, is because they're significant costs. We think the vape industry is currently avoiding at least £200 million worth of costs. They see that as profit. That is false profit. That is the environmental damage that's being caused by these. Next slide. And here's some guidance that we provided for local authority. Next slide, please. This is where you should go. So as local authorities, they should be speaking to their local producer compliance scheme who works with them on the other electricals, or their waste management company. We've provided some vape recycling posters. We provided some social media posts as well. Next slide, please. Some of these are very sort of factual. So this is the stuff that would be at the household waste side. The key point to consider here is that we are doing this with no financing whatsoever from the vaping industry. This is us in the space of electricals, recognizing that this is an issue. But at the moment, none of the funding that is provided to us has ever come from a vape producer. And therefore, the call is on vape producers to be stepping up, and vape retailers too. We're talking about high street retailers, Smiths, Tesco, Asda, who are profiting from this as well. So that's a really important thing to focus on. Is it's not just a niche industry. It's, you know, it's the mainstays of the Great British High Street who have been profiting from these vapes and are not stepping up and doing what they need to do. Next slide. I think that's it. That's just a flavour of some of the HypnoCat stuff, if for those who haven't seen it. But yes, thanks for the opportunity, and obviously around for questions later.
Thanks very much, Scott. There's some really quite powerful facts and information in that, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the panel discussion. Moving on to Kate Pike now, who's the lead officer for vaping at the Chartered Trading Standards Institute. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thank you everybody for having me here today. My colleague, my fellow lead officer for vaping at CTSI is David Hunt, who many of you will know. He is actually based in London, and I'm sure you've met him before, but he's on leave this week, so asked if I could deliver this presentation. But as I say, you're very fortunate in London to benefit from David's knowledge and experience. So just quickly, the role of trade and standards in e-cigarette enforcement is that we are responsible for enforcing a number of pieces of regulation. Main ones are the tobacco related products regulations, which dictate the size and the presentation of the product. We also enforce the underage sales regulations, which prevent people selling to children. There are other bits of regulation which do come into play, but the two key ones are the product presentation and the age of sale. So next slide, please. And I just wanted to highlight, in terms of youth vaping, the rise in intelligence regarding vapes. So the intelligence reports on sales of age-restricted items have increased to almost 5,000, and you will be and probably ought to be concerned about the rise in intelligence around sales of tobacco to children. And I know smoking prevalence among children has reduced, but there is certainly an increase in reports of people selling to children. But the biggest area of increase has been around e-cigarettes, and it's 2/3 of the reports of sales to children are around e-cigarettes. So next slide, please. So this is just to say where the increase. We've only got figures, fairly recent figures, because Trade and Standards is a local service in local authorities, and therefore each local authority will have their own information, but gathering it together on a national basis is not so easy. The Operation Joseph, which I'll talk about in a minute, has enabled us to gather some of this data. So in 2022-23, there were at least 1,200 premises tested with an underage volunteer, and the failure rate was around 27.3%. As you can see, the data for 2023-24 is actually just for Q1. We haven't quite got the Q2 data in yet, but you can see a significant amount of premises, and the failure rate it's fell a little, but it's still around a quarter, which is very high. When you consider that all of these test purchases were intelligence led, we don't just go out and say, oh, do you know what, I think I'm going to try that shop over there. We need to have intelligence to suggest that those premises are selling to children before we go out and do a test purchase. So that you know, that's a very high failure rate. Could we have the next slide, please? And I also wanted to mention the seizures of illegal vapes. Now, although illegal vapes aren't particularly sold to children more than adults, there's certainly we are seeing a large amount of illegal vapes on the market, which may be more attractive to children. That they're certainly being sold to children, but they're also being sold to adults. And in 2022-23, inland, we seized at least 750,000, and again in Q1, well over 250,000 in Q1 alone. And that doesn't count what we're seizing at ports. There's obviously been a significant amount of seizures at Heathrow and other ports around the country. What we can seize at ports, because the regulations aren't desperately clear around importation. So the difference between legal and illegal are an illegal vape is one which contains more than 2 millimeters of liquid, for example. It might have a higher level of nicotine. It might not have the right health warning. I'll show you some of these products, and then I think it's the next slide. Could I come on to the next slide, please? So yeah, here's some products which may or may not be illegal. So the Prime vape and the Twister bar, you can see they're designed to look like little drinks canisters with the little straw. Now here's an interesting one. The slush puggy product. When you look at the front of that product, you can probably think, oh, I know that's illegal, but I'm not quite sure that you know why that's illegal. I suspect you'll probably say because it's got 12,000 puffs and it's a disposable. Now, if you look at the back of that product, you will see, and it's very, very small writing, so you may not be able to see it. The product actually isn't a disposable vape, so something to bear in mind. It actually contains a rechargeable vape with a couple of canisters. So I don't think it's illegal because of that, and something to bear in mind that that's called disposable. What's illegal, I can tell you immediately what's illegal, is the fact that it says warning where the warning is, because that isn't actually in the regulations. So in the regulations, it's very clear that this product contains nicotine, which is a highly addictive substance, should fill the whole area of the warning space, and the word warning is not required. Nobody is going to go to their local authority legal department and say, I want to take a prosecution because they put the word warning in when they shouldn't do, but it's a good indication that maybe that product should be looked at. But in itself, that's probably not illegal, and something to bear in mind, that the fact it says 12,000 puffs disposable is not necessarily making it illegal. And all this talk at the moment about banning disposables, thinking about products like this which aren't disposable, but they call themselves disposable because that's what's attractive to the market. Could I have the next slide, please? So Operation Joseph, which was announced by the government earlier in the year, which is around trying to coordinate some of the action that we're taking locally to disrupt vaping, involves some funding from government to do things on a national basis, which makes more sense on a national basis. And one of those is online underage sales test purchasing. Bricks and mortar test purchasing is far better done locally in communities because that's where the premises are. But online test purchasing should be done nationally because it doesn't actually make any difference where you live and where you purchase. And we've started that now. We're also, within that project, may carry out some bricks and mortar test purchasing at specific types of premises, but that will depend on what the data is telling us and where the failure rates are. So we'll carry on looking at that. Next slide, please. So the future, in terms of, it's already been mentioned that we need to respond to the smoke-free generation consultation. We need to close the loopholes and restrict promotion to children. We need to look at the environmental impacts, which Scott has already highlighted. The environmental impact on not just of disposables, and I think, just running down that rabbit hole and forgetting that there are environmental impacts from the rechargeables as well is really important, that we don't do that. We need to remember, we need to look at it in a round. We obviously want to know about the longer term impact of smoking prevalence. And I think Anne mentioned that they're continually kept under review. But the most important thing we would say to anybody is please report when you see sales to children, when you see illegal vapes being sold, please report. The more intelligence we've got, the better targeted enforcement action that we can take. So we really do want people to report. I will add in the links to the reporting line to the slide for when it's circulated, so you've got that information. Thank you very much.
Kate, thank you very much. It's very clear asks. And I think it's really interesting around how using intelligence to target enforcement action, and some clear asks from local authority colleagues. Moving on now to our last, but definitely not least speaker, is Hazel Cheeseman. She's Deputy Chief Exec of ASH, and she's going to be talking to us around young people and vaping and how we can effectively communicate to the issue. So very warm welcome to Hazel.
Thank you, and we're doing well on time. We've had so many fascinating speakers. So thanks, Jim, for moving my slide on. I'm going to talk about kind of how we frame our communications on vaping for young people, and put it in the round, as it were, which I think is important. And I just wanted to put in the chat. Hopefully that will work. Before I get going, several people have alluded to the consultation process, which is underway on looking at the smoke-free generation, raising the age of sale 1 year every year, and also looking at further regulations around vaping. We definitely encourage people to respond to that consultation. I've put in the chat the link to our webinar that we have with the CMO on Friday, which I would urge you to watch if you weren't able to attend. And also we will be circulating more materials to support people to respond to that consultation. So I just wanted to make that pitch right at the beginning there. So then moving on to how we might communicate around this topic, which is not without its challenges. And this is, I think, a good summary of the issue from the Chief Medical Officer, as he has said here. So if you smoke, vaping is much safer, as Anne has already set out in her slides right at the top. But if you don't smoke, don't vape. And clearly the reason for that, again, are the reasons that Anne had at the top, that it's unlikely that vaping is completely risk-free, and that we don't want young people to acquire an addiction where they need not. And marketing of vapes to children is utterly unacceptable, which hopefully we all agree on. So if we move on to my next slide, I'm going to kind of frame my presentation a little bit around that slide. So of course, it's important when we're thinking about this to keep in mind the very substantial harms from smoking. It is easy to lose sight, I think, when we get the issue of vaping is complex and broad, and it's easy to lose sight of the ongoing tragedy that smoking has been for us in this country over the last 100 or so years probably. And vaping has been an important part of how we have been reducing smoking among adults, and we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about our communications. Jim, if you want to move on to the next slide. And that's just to reinforce the point that vaping, smoking rates have been falling among adults as vaping rates have been going up, and we know from research done by UCL and by others that vaping is contributing to those declines in smoking in adults. If you move to the next slide, Jim. But then this is the crux of the issue that we're here to discuss today. So if you don't smoke, don't vape. And Anne has already set out, if you move on to the next slide, Jim, that we have seen an increase in young people vaping. And we have seen this sort of worrying increase in young people that have never smoked vaping. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are young people who would never have smoked, but nonetheless, we do have this increase, which we're not really seeing in adults. So the orange line there is 11 to 17-year-olds who have never smoked. And you can see there is an increase there, quite a steep increase there in the rate at which they are currently vaping that is not being seen so much in adults, which is the black line. It's still quite low. I mean, we're at 2.3%, but that trend is not reassuring and certainly something that we want to curb. So if we move on to the next slide, Jim. So, and again, Anne alluded to this in her slides. These labels have got very tiny for some reason, so apologies for that. Maybe we can make them bigger when the slides go round. So this is a comparing the young people's perceptions of harm of vaping between 2013 and 2023. So the black line there is 2013, and the orange is 2023. So what we see is that in 2013, 73% of young people thought that vaping was less harmful than smoking, but that's fallen now to a third. And over half of 11 to 17-year-olds think that vaping is as or more harmful than smoking. So this is concerning because it's inaccurate. We know from the evidence that Anne presented at the top that vaping is much, much less harmful than smoking. But also, as Anne said in her presentation, some of the reasons that people have given for why we've seen an increase in teen vaping is because they don't perceive there to be harms. But the direction, the trend is in the other direction. And it's interesting to hear from Shelby about the young people want to be told about the harms from vaping by teachers, because plainly they are identifying from the media, from the environment, that vaping is something that's very harmful, and they wish to be told about that. They're concerned that the wall is being pulled over their eyes to some extent. So we have to think really carefully about how we communicate with young people honestly about what we know about the harms from vaping. But I don't think we need to be worried that by somehow conveying accurately what the harms may be, what we do and don't know, that might somehow lead them to take up vaping, because plainly young people are fairly ambivalent. You know, the risk around vaping are not enormously relevant in the decision-making process about whether to vape or not. Let's have a look at the next slide. So what will work? Well, I think we have to go back to what we know has worked for tobacco. We spent a long time through the 80s and 90s communicating to young people about the harms from smoking. It's very, very harmful. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's very, very harmful. And no behaviours changed really at all across those 2 decades. Teen smoking remained absolutely static throughout that time period. It was only when we started changing the environment that people were growing up in, through regulating, and particularly regulating advertising, that we saw falls in teen vaping. And I think it's about changing the environment that young people are growing up in is where we will be able to arrest the current trend in teen vaping. So let's have a look at the next slide. Yeah, so this speaks to that issue around kind of awareness of promotion. So we only started asking this question in our survey in 2022. So this is just a comparison between 2022 and 2023. And as you'll know from Anne's earlier slides, vaping rates among teenagers started to increase from about 2021 onwards. So, but a big increase in awareness of promotion in different settings. So the far left is in shops, and that's so half of young people, 11 to 17-year-olds in 2023, perceiving them to be promoted, e-cigarettes in vaping products in shops. And then the next is online. Yeah, those labels have got very tiny, but hopefully when they're circulated, they'll be easier to read. So, promotion in store is a big source of concern, and it is a big source of where young people are getting their information about vaping in terms of their perception of what it is and what it means for them. If you move on to the next slide, Jim. And yeah, just to kind of reinforce the places in which I think this reinforces to some extent the information that Shelby was giving us. People are not finding it challenging to purchase products from shops, but clearly there are informal sources where people are getting products from too. If you move on to the next slide. Okay, so as I have been saying in this presentation, as we talk about the vaping to young people, we do need to put it in context of the impact on adults, but also we need to not fall into the trap of repeating things which are not true because we think that will somehow change young people's behaviour. I don't think the evidence suggests that it will. We have there's a link here. It's quite difficult to read this slide at the moment, but there's a link here to this briefing with these common myths about vaping, where we go through some of the things that have been said, particularly in the media, about vaping, which are not accurate. So that vaping is more harmful than smoking, which it's not. That vaping is more addictive than smoking. We don't have evidence to support that at the moment. Certainly vaping, it's possible for people to become addicted to vaping, but it doesn't appear to be more addictive than smoking. About 70% of young people that try smoking go on to be daily smokers, which is one of the reasons why the government is looking to bring in this raising the age of sale rule in order to protect young people from that addiction. We don't appear to have the same rate of conversion for teenagers vaping at the moment. There's all sorts of stuff about what disposable vapes can and can't deliver, and that's much more about how you consume nicotine. You can read the briefing for more detail. Vaping has not been proven as a gateway into smoking, although it's often said that it is. It's not been proven that nicotine damages brain development. Certainly, we don't have much evidence outside of tobacco smoking in any event. And then this idea that that children are vaping only because of the flavours, and flavours are clearly playing a part in the appeal of products. But we had all sorts of many flavours on the market way before we saw this increase in teen vaping. The increase in teen vaping is linked to these disposable products. So if you could, my next slide. So if these are all the things that we might not say, what will we say? So I would definitely recommend the materials from that have been developed by Sheffield with some input from us. They're really clear. They provide young people with accurate information about the relative harms between smoking and vaping. They do include information about the environmental impact. And they also make this point, which I think is really important, that most young people are not vaping or smoking. You know, if you want to get a teenager to do something, implying that everybody else is doing it is quite an effective way to get them to try it. So, you know, giving some, you know, not clouding the understanding around the proportions of people that are using these products, you know, trying to give people accurate information about their environment. And I do think that focusing on the way in which young people are being marketed to is also very valuable. There's this line here about not being duped, that the people who are selling you these products, people that are promoting you these products as under 18-year-olds, don't care about you. They only care about profit. You could, I think, tell from what Shelby was saying earlier that that is certainly a message that's likely to resonate with young people. I can't remember what's on my next slide. Let's have a look. Okay, I got to the end. So these are just some more sources of information which are hopefully useful. And I can stop there, and then we have lots of time for a full discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Hazel. Can I ask all of the speakers to put their cameras on? And I'm really delighted to introduce Louise Ross, who is clinical consultant at the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training, and also Alison Keating, who is head of tobacco control and substance misuse at the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities London, who are going to join our panel of speakers. We've had some really interesting comments in the chat, and I think really summarising how we communicate to young people, sometimes nuanced messages, but also I think linking in terms of environmental and health concerns together, and where we can talk across both. But also I think about how we're supporting young people whom vaping is problematic and what referral pathways and supports appropriate for them. I'm going to open it up to speakers on the floor at the moment. Would anybody like to raise their hand and ask a question now? No? Okay, I think one of them, would ask Alison around what support and what OHID are doing, particularly around pathways and what the evidence is around how we should support young people, if anyone else wants to come in, for whom vaping is problematic, and what pathways are there that are young people friendly and young people specific?
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks for asking the difficult questions straight away. First of all, with great apologies to everybody. I've missed quite a lot of this because of my technical issues, which I did put in the chat, but I'm so glad to join you a little bit at the end. I'm not sure I can answer your question as specifically as you've asked it, Kirsten, but I think I would like to say really clearly that one of the key announcements that also came with the smoke-free generation was the additional monies that go into all local authorities to address smoking cessation delivery locally, but also there was a lot of discussion about campaign and additional campaign information. So I think as London stakeholders, we will want to think how we plug into those kind of campaign stuff and how we work together on it. And I am encouraging all London boroughs, first of all, that first message from my boss, Chris Whitty, that a reminder that, of course, vaping is much more safer for adults who do smoke, and thinking about using the swap to stop that is currently out there. A number of London boroughs have already bid, and encouraging you to bid and continue to use vapes as an adult stop smoking cessation tool. But also thinking about, when you are building your stop smoking services, what are you going to do to think about pathways to build on some of the stuff that I can see in the chat that I unfortunately didn't get to hear, but about the insights from young people and what they're telling you about what you need to build locally. We would certainly want to work with the LTA and Tracy and others and all of you to think about how we might do this at a sort of wider level across London, and what are the best pathways. Thanks, Kirsten. So I'm not sure if I answered you exactly as directly, but it's the best that I can say in the circumstances.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks. And I think, London's got a really good infrastructure, hasn't it? And a long history of partnership working across different organisations. I think it was a really interesting question that leads on around how we're supporting young people. Valerie's asked a question around, is there any data about the ethnicity of young people who are vaping? So do we know who is vaping? And I think it'd be a good thing. So if we do, then what services do we need to make sure that that's appropriate and supportive for them who want to stop? And then I think the second question I wanted to ask is really around this communication issue around our different audiences of young people not starting vaping, and those very clear messages from Chris. And then how we're also communicating at the same time to adults who've got sometimes adult smokers some very different messaging. So let's open it up around ethnicity, and then if anyone wants to come in around how we're doing nuanced communication across this different populations.
Do you want me to come in, Kirsten?
Yeah, that's great.
I think we could probably, unless Anne's going to correct me, deal with the ethnicity question quite quickly. No, I don't. I'm not aware of data that exists that would break it down by ethnicity. We know that there are different patterns around smoking by ethnicity that vary. So higher rates of smoking, for example, among Bangladeshi men, but lower rates of smoking in many other kind of ethnic groups, for example. And it would be not unreasonable to think that those vaping patterns would also hold up, but I don't know. So, and Anne's not disagreeing with me, so I'm assuming that we don't know. In terms of that kind of complex communication activity, for me, I think focusing on vaping as a quitting aid is actually an important part of the message to young people, because we've had sort of more than a decade of vaping products being very widely used as kind of quit tools by adults, and only a few years of teenagers using them in ways that do not really support public health. Getting back to a public kind of image and understanding that these are not very exciting things that people use to stop smoking it is a really important message to land with young people. And I don't think we need to be worried about saying these are things people use to stop smoking, because that's not an enormously kind of attractive message. I think the thing that is the challenge that we have is that I kind of think that our communication to young people it's not irrelevant to their behaviour, but the thing that is going to make most difference to young people's behaviour is that wider environment. If we can remove the marketing, if we can make products less affordable, if we can make sure that the environmental side is being properly emphasised and properly dealt with, I think those are the things that will have a bigger impact on young people than the messages that we can communicate in schools. Not that we shouldn't try to get those messages right. I just think that the other things are going to have a bigger impact.
Thanks, Hazel. I don't know if this one for Scott or Kate wants to come in, but Martin Knight's asked around banning disposable vapes, and will the industry then just switch to cheaper rechargeable but equally environmentally unfriendly and damaging products?
No, it's a very good question. You've sort of got a hierarchy of environmental challenges posed by vapes. Your traditional tank and fill ones are really no different than, say, an electric toothbrush, in the sense that they have a life cycle, a lifetime that's comparatively long, can be robust because they're made to last, and whilst tricky to recycle, are really like any small electrical at that point. So an electric toothbrush is I guess a good analogy of that. There are other environmental issues associated with all types of vaping too, not least vape juice in the packaging that's often under talked about as well. A lot of small, quite difficult to recycle plastic and cardboard. And then, of course, the packaging around disposable vapes. And then the sort of next best version, it would be this rechargeable with pod system that many of them have at the moment as well. And it's a likely destination should single-use ones be banned to move to that. That is still a problematic. If they're being sold and disposed of in their millions, you've got millions of little pods that are electrical and are damaging and are a waste of resources. The rechargeable units themselves, and I've played around with a couple of them, they're not built to last. Because it's, if you think about the investment that, say, Apple would put into the connection for charging your phone, this is the cheaper end of that connection, so that connection will probably break, but they are better. The challenge I see though with that strand is what happens as well if you get locked into a sort of vape ecosystem, if your pod isn't available where you want to vape, what do you do then? And you'll buy another, another rechargeable one. But I think it's fair to say statistically they would be better. But is it still the best use of those resources to have what is still a relatively few time use product?
Thanks, Scott. Marina's asked a really interesting question. Sorry, does somebody else want to come in on that?
I was just going to come in to say that the absolute key thing, I think, is that we move away from products which should be recycled just being put in bins, calling them disposable. Even trading standards are even uncomfortable with use single use, because many of the products that are disposable aren't single use. So we just need to maybe agree a terminology, but the absolute most important thing is that we stop putting them in landfill or in bins generally. They need to be recycled, because at least that's a starter for 10 in terms of making them slightly more environmentally less damaging than what we're currently doing with them.
Fantastic, thanks, Kate. And Marina's asked a question about what the views of the panel are on standardised packaging. Someone wants to come in on that one.
I'm happy to start, because we've done some experimental work in surveys. We use the ASH survey and also some of the ITC surveys, where we've randomised people to look at standardised packs and branded packs. And what we found is that the standardised packs did seem to deter young people, but didn't seem to deter adults, smokers, who we'd want to encourage to use these. So I think that does hold promise as an avenue. I think one of the difficulties is that it's not quite the same as cigarettes, that people dispose of the packaging. So you also have to look at the product itself, and perhaps the colourfulness of those. But also, again, we probably wouldn't want to see the same standardised packaging as on tobacco cigarettes, so that people do distinguish the products when they look at them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Does anybody else on the panel want to come in on that question?
Yeah, I completely agree with Anne. I think, it's definitely something, if people are responding to the consultation, I would sort of urge them to say that this is something that we should look at, removing some of the branded, colourful elements on products and packaging, but also keeping that distinction between tobacco and vaping, so that we don't want to feed into this very high levels of misunderstanding, particularly among adults.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any questions as they want to put into the chat, or to put their hand up to ask the panel?
I don't think that people can put their hand up.
Oh, they can't put their
hands up. They're not putting their hands up.
Right. Okay, right. Okay, I'll pick another question out of the chat. Martin said, additionally, following the potential ban, would other equally cheap and accessible products be likely to emerge, replacing disposables as used by children and young people? I think that's a great question. And I'll put a question in around, I think, Hazel, your point around most young people don't smoke and don't vape. So for those young people that do, is there a sort of a convalescing of a sort of risky behaviours, and are they the young people that we should be targeting for other risk reduction interventions? So I think first question is around, will they move to other things, and the second one is this convergence of risk behaviours that we should focus on. Don't know who wants to take this question.
Shall I take this second one? And yeah. I'm happy to come back on the first one, but are they the kids that take risks? That it would seem likely from the research that Anne and others have done. The common liability is that these are, again, we've got this very high overlap between the young people that vape and the young people that smoke. But when we looked at the data recently, we found, a relationship between vaping and cannabis use, less so with alcohol, but alcohol was much more of a, is much more commonly consumed. And so, yes, I think these are very likely to be the kids, and they're much more likely to be the kids that have got poor mental health, that are from disadvantaged backgrounds, that are in the care system. They fall into the category of vulnerable kids who, and it's why the calibration of your policy in schools is really important. Sort of treating this only as an issue of discipline is inappropriate when we're talking about something that is addictive and likely a group in the population that already experiences quite high levels of disadvantage. So, I can absolutely see how there are challenges in schools with sort of managing these behaviours. But schools are very good at managing behaviours by and large, and seeing it as a behaviour and addiction in a vulnerable population should be the starting point from a kind of educational point of view, I think.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Hazel. Louise, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, thank you. I'm really glad you said that, Hazel, because I think those vulnerable populations, the looked after children, the ones that are using CAM services, or the ones who need CAM services and are on a long waiting list, are sometimes, I believe, using substances of all sorts to manage their moods. And out of all the things that they could be doing, vaping is possibly one of the least harmful, especially if they dropped vaping and went on to smoking instead. So I'd just make an appeal for people to understand that this is a complex issue, and some young people will be managing their very difficult circumstances with vaping, and taking the same line with all young people isn't always helpful. I mean, in our Stop Smoking service, we work with looked after children before the law changed to forbid sales of vaping to young people. And vaping was the only thing that they wanted to use to stop smoking. They weren't interested in the NRTs. So there's some background stuff here. Thank you.
I'm happy to.
That's really interesting, Hazel.
I'm happy to come in on Martin's question about whether people will switch. I mean,
I could do it as well if you want, Hazel.
Okay, go on then. You go first, Scott.
Yeah, I was just, I believe, I've never properly followed this up, but the single-use vape as we know it actually is an innovation in response to regulations, I believe, in the States, where they basically designed this to get around some regulatory impositions that were placed there. I think, this is obviously a very profitable business now. And it's money being made by selling something to people who have an addiction to what you're selling to them. So the entrepreneurial spirit, if that's the kindest way I can think about it, will inevitably lead to responses to any restrictions in terms of how this product can be sold. So it's going to be needs to be very carefully considered what's in that definition of what a disposable single-use, vape, and totally agree everything Kate was saying before about the need to be clear on language. But yes, there will be innovations if something is banned, and it's watching those and being mindful of those. But yes, I think the profit will drive that innovation, if nothing else.
I would build on what Scott says there. I think you would expect the industry will innovate, industry will want to continue to sell products to people. And I think it's why our response needs to be something which both limits the demand and supply of these products. And that's why the marketing is so crucial, that, removing some of these marketing elements should decrease the demand for products. And equally, it's why price is probably something important to look at as well. So, yeah, if we don't reduce the demand for products, where there's a market, there will probably be somebody to service that market.
Thank you. And I'm just going to bring in Mike Robinson's question here then. How are the liquids in vapes manufactured, and actually would it be feasible to charge a duty on the liquids as we do for alcohol and tobacco?
So
Kate,
shall I come in there? I come in there. Yeah, actually, we think it'd be really good if there was there's duty on, there's an import duty obviously on anything that comes from overseas, but it's actually quite low on vapes. It's slightly higher on disposable vapes, single-use vapes, whatever we're kind of calling them, than they are on other types of liquid or vapes. But there isn't an excise duty. And if we believe that an excise duty would be really helpful, because not only would it enable, especially if one that you could vary depending on the type of product, not only would it increase the price of certain types of vapes, particularly the disposable vapes, maybe to make them move them out of the pocket money, 3 for £10 sort of area, but also it would give powers to those who enforce the excise regime, which is not just trading standards, also HMRC and Border Force, which would increase significantly boots on the ground, able to deal with illegal products coming into the country, which is a major issue. And we'd have more people out there able to support that. So yeah, I think it's a really good idea, and definitely one we will be mentioning in our response to the consultation.
Thanks, Kate. Tracy, I've got a question for Shelby from Young People's Partnership for London. Shelby, what do you think are some of the aspects of the webinar today that we can work with you on to take back to your focus groups?
Yeah, I literally just answered in the chat, but I definitely think there's something there around how we support young people with mental health and vaping, and a bit like Hazel was saying around the external factors that might disadvantage those young people that are turning to vapes. I think there's also something there around working with young people that are doing it because it's trendy, or they feel peer pressure to do it at school because it's such a heavy environment now. And then, yeah, I also think there's something there around working with young people to look at the marketing that's out there now and how the marketing going forward would potentially move away from being targeted at young people, or what would deter some people from vaping, and is it actually the marketing of the colours and the flavours and things like that that do pull more young people in? But there's so many conversations out today that definitely there's definitely a pan like scope of London project in there somewhere around vaping.
Thanks. And Scott's asked a question, is that did vaping and the environment and recycling come up in any of your panels?
Yeah, the environment came up actually. I answered earlier in the chat, but there was a lot of comments around how there is a climate environment risk to it, but it's not spoken about in schools. And then a lot of our young people said that they don't feel like if they turn around to their peers and said that, oh, you're using a disposable vape is bad for the environment, they didn't think that would deter people from stopping vaping. It was more that it was just a problem to it, but they didn't feel they would change people's views on vaping as such.
Thank you. And I just want to just pick up some points in the chat around, and I think we've briefly touched on it, around the young people who are vaping are more vulnerable to both other risk factors and risky behaviour. And are we cognizant or thinking about any of the unintended consequences that regulation would have on that group, and do we need to do something differently or think about that prior to any legislation being implemented? I don't know if Hazel wants to come in, or Anne.
So Kirsten, so that you're then talking about if regulation of vapes changes, what that might mean for some groups in the population. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's already illegal for people under 18 to be sold these products, and that's not going to change. The things that might change would hopefully change the environment and reduce, as I say, reduce demand for products, and hopefully help to protect those more vulnerable groups. But I think plainly, as we're rolling out all of these regulations, it behoves us in public health to think about how do we target more into disadvantaged communities, because that's where smoking rates will be highest, that's where vaping rates will be highest. And we have got new funding coming into the system, as has been coming into stop smoking services. And I think thinking about if we're going to make sure that these are not the kids that are smoking and vaping in the future, then we need to make sure that their parents aren't smoking, that they're kind of growing up in smoke-free households, that all of the shops around that they're growing up around are not selling them products. I think it is about doubling down into our disadvantaged communities, which I think London's often quite good at, and now we have some more resources to be able to do that.
Kirsten, is it okay to come in as well? Oh, Anne, sorry, yes. I've jumped ahead of you. Sorry.
So Anne, then Wendy.
Well, I was going to say Wendy first. Go on.
Oh, thanks. And I was just going to comment about who we work with as well, and thinking about the opportunities here around. Someone mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned that we've just recently this week, in fact, linked in with our community safety teams and looking at ways in which we can work with them around training, around those brief conversations about their intel. They will know some of those young people that are vulnerable, and they will be noticing when they're coming in and out of shops. We've had intel about parked cars parking outside schools, and they are literally selling vapes outside of schools and things like that. So it's around who we are working with as well to protect those young people, to be picking up and then guiding them into services. I'm also quite concerned about you know, like we said about their addiction and their impact on their ability to concentrate in school and their impact on mental health if we make it inaccessible to them. But so I think it's that those pathways to support as well need to be really clear for those young people. If they do want to stop, where do they go? And I think for us in services, we need to be thinking about what that is, what our response is around that, because we're there as, you know, we're saying it's a cessation aid for adults, but what are we offering, if anything, for young people as well, and support, because they will have those needs and behaviour needs as well. So I think, yeah, just looking at who we're working with is really important. Thanks.
Thanks. We've got 3 minutes for other questions, and we've done so well on timing. So I very quickly want to bring in Anne, Alison and Louise before we need to wrap up and go to our Mentimeter questions.
So there is some good research going on about vaping cessation at the moment, which we can keep an eye on. But I also wanted to put it in the wider context, not just of cigarette smoking, but that slide I showed about driving people to other forms of drug use. So I would hope that certainly health education in schools can put this in the round. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks. And Alison and then Louise.
And just to follow on from Wendy and Anne's points, I suppose it's just as local authority stop smoking leads to also make contact with your substance misuse leads in terms of young people. There's additional money in the system. We actually are not providing enough support to young people who've got alcohol and who are using cannabis, for example, and there are real opportunities where both parts of the system have got additional monies to think at a local authority level, how do we develop those pathways and really wrap around our most needy young people.
Great points. Thanks, Alison. And Louise, did you want to come in?
A very quick one about vaping cessation. It's perfectly possible for people to reduce the amount they use, and I would advise parents or teachers to pass this on. That, you know, if somebody actually wants to stop vaping, they can reduce the frequency, the duration, and the strength that they use, and you know, people can usually manage that very well themselves once they want to stop.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. This is us out of time. We're going to go to a Mentimeter in a minute. I want to give a huge thanks to all of our speakers, and also Tracy from the London Tobacco Alliance and Stop Smoking London, and Jim Patterson for ASH, who pulled this together, because there's an awful lot of work that goes behind the scenes. So thank you for them, and thank you to all the speakers. It's recorded, so you'll be able to get a copy of it.